Still in Griffin, chapter 6, 6.2, human interests in the natural world. So we've been looking at Griffin's notion of, his analysis, that is, of value judgments, right? This taste model in terms of sort of your immediate, knee-jerk kind of reactions expressed in your preferences. Yeah, just, valuations are how I calls them as I sees them. That seemed to be problematic. And then we bumped it up a little bit to a rational preference. And then that guy came along who only wants to count blades of grass all day. That looks a little odd. So we say, okay, logical consistency. Now we got to start talking about rational. And the rational, doesn't handle the grass blade counter very well. So now we got to start talking about appropriate. And then we start talking about, values, maybe they aren't really just knee-jerk, maybe they come from the community. So we kind of see them and we can evaluate them, and maybe some come from the community and some are subjective. Okay, and what Griffin is really going to say, I don't really want to prioritize either side of things. I want to say, Aristotle asked the question, is X valuable because it's valued, or because someone values it, or because it's intrinsically valuable? Do we have to make that choice? Why can't we just say, nah, I'm not going to prioritize either? And so that's Griffin's approach, that it's a little bit, and this is a fairly modern approach to ethics that's reminiscent of what's going on in the philosophy of science. So as Griffin has alluded to thinkers like Wittgenstein and Donald Davidson to support some of his understandings of values, he doesn't mention it, but he also trades on some results in the philosophy of science. So I'll get to that in a second. But he's using that to help talk about ethics. Anyways, now think about the heading of this subsection: human interests and the natural world. We have humans have interests, of course. All kinds of critters have interests. Trees do. Maybe not interests in terms of them always being consciously formed, but are ours? I mean, we have interests like in terms of needing oxygen. I don't really think much about my need for breathing until, let's say, it was ever cut off, or you get hit with a medicine ball and you're like, I can't breathe, or things like that, or I'm thirsty. You don't think of those kinds of needs generally, but they're there. Right? So human interests, like the animal world, as Aristotle would say, we're continuous with the animal world. We have food and water. Those are kind of easy, right? When you're deprived of these things, and by easy, I mean, when you're deprived of water, you dehydrate. When you're deprived of food, you eventually, not right away, but you get hungry and then you start starving. So when these interests are not fulfilled, it's not that difficult. Like a doctor can tell you, hey, you're dehydrated. You may not even know, right? Like, geez, why do I have this crampy feeling or whatever? And the doctor could say, wow, you're dehydrated or something. So lots of human interests are not necessarily conscious, but some are, and those are the more tricky ones. Those are what Griffin says are kind of like the non-biological ones. You can call them sociological, psychological, whatever, but they're definitely there, says Griffin, right? And they're not really biological, but that doesn't mean they're not important. So that's his whole point, is that human interests, lots of them are extremely important. They're very real to us. I could actually have a non-biological one, like the passion for reading philosophy, and I forget to eat, right? And then afterwards I go, man, I'm hungry, or I'm really thirsty. So these interests, even the non-biological ones, can dominate the biological ones for a time. But nonetheless, they can. So it's not like that these are even perfectly ranked. They can be very real and push each other to the side, at least temporarily. Once I have a drink, then a glass of water or something, then I go back to reading philosophy. Okay, but the point is that there's different kinds of interests, and they're real, and they're not all biological. Hence the little ampersand here, the and, human interests and the natural world. Some of them are biological, some non-biological. Sometimes with the non-biological ones, we could say it's a matter of an attitude, right? You have a bad attitude about things. And we could say that, these kinds of preferences and desires and interests, they're just your attitude. And if you had a better attitude, you wouldn't care about that stuff. We do that to people. And sometimes we're grateful if someone says, really the real problem is your attitude towards the world, and you've got these bad interests, right? These are not good interests at heart. right? Remember the taste model, right? Some of your actual preferences are terrible. You got to get your like. What do we say to friends? You got to get your priorities straight, man. You are messed up in terms of your interests, and we're not talking about these, right? Unless someone has eating disorders or whatever. Forget that for the moment. But like your non-biological interests, like your priorities, man, you got to get your priorities straight. You need an attitude adjustment. We often talk like that. That's all Griffin's really getting at here. And sometimes sometimes it is an attitude, but sometimes it's like a mere attitude that you could change, that we would all agree is a bad attitude. But sometimes we say, no, the attitude is important and your surroundings are problematic, right? So like in a non-bio, human interest would be a sense of accomplishment in life, right? That could be important, but what you maybe ascertain as being that which fulfills that sense of accomplishment, maybe you have a bad attitude there. You got to be more realistic. I just want to succeed. I just want to, yeah, but you've got totally unrealistic expectations. You don't have those kinds of talents, or, we're not living in, you can't become excellent at medieval jousting and have it as a career. That job doesn't exist anymore. Something like that. You need to search for other areas for your personal fulfillment. So sometimes the umbrella attitude could be good, like a sense of accomplishment, but the particular ways to get it might be wrong or a goofy thing. So there's all kinds of complexities here, but nonetheless, sometimes the non-bio things we would say are entirely appropriate. It's not just merely a bad attitude or an attitude in a flimsy state. It's a more deep orientation towards something. And Griffin calls that like an appropriate attitude or like a reaction. So, and he wants to talk a little bit about like sensitivity. And philosophers have talked about, having a sensitivity to values. Aristotle even talks about that in the Nicomachean Ethics, like being kind of sensitive to things. And we talk about this in everyday life of, some people, they have really good people skills and they can really read a room. And, we sometimes say, can you go and get sensitivity training? Well, we'd have to presuppose that there's some kind of sensitivity there to be refined. If it weren't there at all, like you can't get a sensitivity injection. It is training, getting, maybe refining your skills at it. Now, you might think this is all hooey and just sort of hand-waving stuff, but they're in the background to Griffin's discussion, shall we say the software or the firmware in the background is this notion of, we have sort of Aristotle's question in the background, but things are valuable because they're valued and there's a sense of intrinsic value. Let's talk a little bit more of what that could mean. So Griffin wants something that's no priority. So again, with that earlier discussion of the metaphysics of HR, of what he was talking about values, the taste model and the perception model, he kind of wants to roll that all together. And he talks about developing our sensitivity. Okay, so let's think about the physical senses that we have. Let's start with the physical model about making judgments. Remember when I talked about this being a red mouse and whatnot. So we have sensitivity to things in the world, like our empirical senses, right? We can pick up on things, right? Where nature, enabled us to have these kinds of senses. And we have a physical sensitivity, which comes from our physical senses. And then we concoct theories, right? So that's how science kind of works, right? Science starts with, and again, this is like a super simplified view of things, but science does start with, some incoming data, and it tries to organize this data along rational lines, tries to look for general patterns, tries to come up with laws that, that fit the pre-existing patterns, and then from the law you can make a prediction, and you go check and see if you can cook up something that'll, satisfy, you go, hey, the theory predicted X, and when I stirred this thing up, I got X, and the theory predicted, hey, that maybe doesn't absolutely confirm, but that helps corroborate your theory. Anyways, there's all kinds of complexities in that, but it is an increasing of our sensitivity to our environment. And it also is that you're stuck right in the middle of the environment while you're gaining your input and you're theorizing about it, right? What you don't have in this understanding that's running in the background of Griffin's going to do this with values. What you don't have is that you sit back, kind of like some people have this sort of everyday notion of science where they assume a God's eye perspective, like, okay, there's your God over here, and you were looking down and you see everything sideways. You see the world as it really is, right? You have that God's eye perspective, and you see the world as it really is over here, and then you look over here and you see humans and their theories, right? So the theory is like over here and the world's over here and you're God, you're up here. You're looking at it like sideways or top down, whatever you want, right? You've got the God's, that's why I often talk about the God's eye perspective. God's not cooking up theories, right? Okay, so anyways, whether or not you believe in God doesn't really matter for my discussion. It's just we don't have that kind of perspective even when we're doing science. Science is something where we're in the middle. And a famous image of science was propounded by a philosopher of science in the 20th century named Otto Neurath. And he said, as a matter of fact, we're kind of like we're in a boat, right, on an ocean. And the boat's not great, but we're trying to fix it up as we go along, and it leaks, and we're plugging leaks, and we're navigating. There's no shore that we can pull, right, and get off the boat and put it up on some kind of, a sawhorse or whatever, or some kind of stand and fix it. No, we're fixing as we go along. That's how science works. It's guess, fix up, plug holes here, and then eventually when the system becomes too full of corks and plugs and gum and eventually it might crash and a new theory comes along that doesn't have those problems and it'll get its problems later. That's one model of science and the history of science. But the important, now that's also a bit debatable, but the key idea is that this is not the case, right? We're not sitting on the outside going, science is over here with its theories, the world's over there, and that's how we check. We don't do that, right? We're in the middle. We're right in the muck of all things. We don't have God's perspective. Well, that's how science works. Well, the same thing kind of works with values, and science too has a kind of circularity, right? We rely on our senses to theorize. We theorize on our senses, and then we check our theories against the senses that we're theorizing about. Is there not some kind of circularity there? Another famous philosopher of the 20th century, named Willard Van Orman Quine, said, yeah, there is a circularity, but here's the thing. Vicious circles and circularity are not a huge problem as long as the circle is big enough, right? Go to a dictionary, look up a word. Let's say you don't know the word of obstreperous or something like that, whatever. And you go and you look up obstreperous and you get a bunch of other words. Let's say you don't understand those words either. You start looking up those words. Let's say as you look up those words, you don't understand any of the definitions of those, and you keep going and you keep going. You're eventually going to find obstreperous down here somewhere. As you keep going, eventually the dictionary will define a term, obstreperous. Eventually it will show up in one of the definitions down here. That's a circle, right? Well, if it's an immediate circle, like obstreperous means obstreperous, you would be like, okay, well, that's pretty useless. But if it's a huge, huge circle, right, you're going to find something along the way that helps you out. So even a circular document like a dictionary can be helpful. And Quine says, yeah, even a vicious circle, if you imagine a vicious circle like, with little teeth in it, like this, right? With the teeth in it, it's not bad. As long as it's big enough, you won't get bit, right? So that's where Quine says, and I think it's true actually in dictionaries, there is some sort of lexicographer's rule about how big the number is of definitions before you can have a repeat, right? It certainly has to be a lot. Otherwise, the dictionary would be useless. But if it's big and really huge, then not so bad. So words being defined in terms of other words, hey, that's how language works, right? And sometimes, yeah, we just point at things and you get an ostensive definition, but not always. So circularity is not intrinsically bad, right? Again, just as long as it's not too, you don't get bit right away. But as long as it's big enough. So the same thing Griffin thinks is going on with values, right? There's in this we're in this for ethics too. We're in Neurath's boat for science and for ethics. There's no privileged position on ethics. There's no privileged observational position on the world. One school of thought called logical positivism used to think that there were privileged sentences, like, pristine sentences, like observation sentences that were pure, like, this is a red mouse. But as you know, like, there's all kinds of things going on here, even when I say this is a red mouse, because again, 100 years ago, or even less than that, if I'd have held something like this up to a crowd and said, this is a red mouse, people would say, well, there's something red there. It's not a mouse. So there's all kinds of context there. And in that sense, there's really no such a thing as a clear, pristine observation sentence, even when we're talking about observation in science, right? Science is loaded with theoretical presuppositions. Think about when you look at an ultrasound, right? Unless you're trained, you don't know what's going on in there. I remember seeing one. I had no clue. And then, of course, the nurse or the doctor says, do you want to know what's going on? Oh, okay. Well, they know how to read it. They can tell you what's going on. Why? Because they went to ultrasound school. I don't know. But they learned how to read those things. So even just sheer, and yet I'm looking at the same ultrasound, right? So there's a lot of theory loaded into observation. Again, you're in that boat on the sea. You can't pull it into dry dock. Okay, so we can't simply jettison our tastes and say they're irrelevant either. We don't do that. We often incorporate them, some of our knee-jerk tastes, the tastes and the values that come in elsewhere and all that. We work with all that, much like the scientist is working with Neurath's boat. So Neurath's boat of ethics, we're all on it. We're trying to figure out things as we go along. And in this sense, we refine also. We increase our sensitivity to things, right? And lots of philosophers in the 20th century did talk about that. That's what the goal of education was. You get refinement. I've mentioned about people getting better at judging wine, right? Can learn how to get better at doing it, right? Unless you just want to completely say, nah, it's all radically subjective. But you really think that someone who has studied wine for years and has tasted all different kinds and evaluated in front of them is actually no better at judging the taste of wine than, let's say, somebody who just rolls off the street and has no idea what wine is what, right? I find that one hard to believe. But, you could dig your heels in and just go with that strict taste model. Griffin isn't. He's saying, no, there's a level of objectivity. It may not be even as high as science, but even science doesn't have that God's eye view. So don't knock ethics just because it doesn't have a God's eye view. Neither does science. Nothing does. We're humans stuck on Neurath's boat. We can get better at debating about human interests, right? Maybe we are better at talking about the value of life than we were a couple hundred years ago. Maybe we do get a better we're more sensitive to the nuances of what the right to life means, right? It means more than just not be wantonly killed by the state. Maybe it means a bit more. And is that completely objective and like 2 + 2? No. Is it completely objective like science? No, but it is an increasing amount of sensitivity, and we can become better at making our moral judgments. So we can have more objectivity about these kinds of things, in the way that scientists, in a similar way, not exactly, but in a similar way that scientists have objectivity about their world. And they don't have perfect objectivity either, because they're always working with theories. You read any science book, scientists don't just talk about the world, they theorize about it, and they work through theories which are predicated on evidence, and the theory helps explain the evidence, and the evidence supports the theory. So you can see this kind of big circularity at work here. But of course, they have pragmatic tests, just like we pragmatically test policies, says Griffin, as well. But there is a deep sense of objectivity. Think about this one, accomplishment in life. Think about the stories, Griffin says, of people on their deathbed, saying, unhappy stories, like wherein someone says, I had a good life, I did X, Y, and Z. I don't want to say what those are because everyone is pretty sensitive about that stuff. But let's say, we can agree on that people actually do mean these things, and they do have true objective meaning when some people say, I had a good life, I have had a great sense of, I pass away with a great sense of accomplishment. And sadly, we would say that it's not just a mere trifle or a mere just expression of a knee-jerk reaction to your whole life. If someone says, I really didn't have a good life, I didn't accomplish what I wanted to, I pass away with regrets, we don't just think that's merely, oh, well, we could be sad about that or not. It doesn't really, no, we take that seriously. So these kinds of human interests, right? There are some of them that are merely attitudes, and some are way deeper than that. These values may not be deeper than our human nature, fine, but that's again where we live. We live in this world of human nature, and it's sort of meshed in with the natural world. But of course, even if we say that it's limited to our human interests and our human nature meshing with the natural world, that's not to say that it's not objective at all, and it's certainly not to say that that's just trivial.